Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. I'm Justice, and today we're going to be covering 28 Days Later in preparation for the upcoming 28 Years Later coming out next month. This entire video is essentially just going to be me gushing over this film. I have very few nitpicks with it. In fact, I only have one, and I'll get into that in a minute. But overall, this is a next to perfect movie, and I feel most people would agree with me making that statement. To even further my point, it's currently sitting at an 87% on Rotten Tomatoes and has a 7.5 out of 10 on IMDb, so I'm just going to make the assumption that most people are going to agree with my take. The thing too that I feel like I need to talk about first and foremost before even getting into this movie is the massive impact that it had on the horror genre. That's something that I talked about throughout the Final Destination series when I was covering those films. Was I enjoy those movies, and yes, they are very popular. I don't think you'd be hard-pressed to say that a lot of people like them, but in the same breath as well, I don't think anyone can say they did anything to actually change the genre. It wasn't any different after they came, whereas this film, you cannot say that. George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead might have given us the modern-day zombie and how they acted, but this film reinvented zombies. And before anybody gets into a debate in the comments with me about this, because yes, I know Danny Boyle doesn't consider them to be zombies in this film, because unlike zombies, they are living and not undead in this film. They're just infected with a rage virus, but they are still very much alive. They're not supernatural by any means. But even keeping all of that in mind, this film still changed the zombie genre, and you'd be, again, very hard-pressed for someone to disagree with you on that. After this film, zombies ran. They were more rage-filled than they had been previously. As I mentioned with George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead, those zombies and zombies that came after that were very slow, meandering, and just overall very mindless. This film changed that, and I'm sure that somebody has made this analogy before, but Night of the Living Dead zombies walked so that 28 Days Later zombies could literally run. Immediately after this film, you had other films that started to replicate this. You see it in the Dawn of the Dead remake, films like Wreck, even The Walking Dead, which I very much think that The Walking Dead either wouldn't exist or it wouldn't look anywhere near what it does now if it weren't for 28 Days Later. Even the opening scene of The Walking Dead, where you have Rick waking up in the hospital room and then going out into the streets and seeing the destroyed city after the apocalypse and not seeing the beginning part of it, is an exact homage or copy, like whatever you want to look at it as, of the beginning sequence in 28 Days Later of Jim waking up in the hospital.
You're just a copycat, but no one's buying that. Up on the discount rack, right in the back of TJ Maxx.
Another thing that I feel like you have to mention with this movie, though this film wasn't made in response to the 9/11 attacks, I do very much think that it resonated with a lot of people's fears at the time. That's something that a lot of other people that are way smarter than me and know like way more what they're talking about can say as well. The whole ideas of societal collapse, government overpower and overreaching, as well as themes of loss of security are all very present in this film, and they are all feelings that were also very present at the time of the 9/11 attacks. I think that's a big part of the reason that this movie blew up the way that it did back then. Not only was it a really good film with a really good screenplay, it also very much reflected fears that were going on at the time with people in the country, and that is a huge part of the reason I think this film did so well, because when you see the end of the world on a big screen in a movie theater, by the time the credits roll, it's just a movie, everything's over, you're able to disassociate it, versus seeing all of the very pressing things that were going on in the news at the time. And I do think the whole thoughts in this film are very prevalent and have aged magnificently well, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic. I think a lot of the fears that you can see in this film can also be coincided with that. That's something about this movie that I can say in huge praise of it is I think it is extremely timeless, a lot of the messages that it does throw out there. To even further the point that this film wasn't made in response to 9/11, filming was actually going on for this movie during the September 11th attacks. Danny Boyle even stated that there was a lot of similarities and parallels to what was going on in the country at the time in the film. Just like in the movie where you see all the missing persons posters all over the streets, very similar images were seen all over New York City right after the attacks. And filming took place over in the United Kingdom, and Danny Boyle even said that he didn't think that his crew would have been granted permission to close off parts of Whitehall over in Westminster after the attacks. Now to jump forward to present day a little bit and go into something a little less depressing and more frustrating. Back in 2022, Disney, who bought out Fox, lost the rights to this film. Therefore, 28 days later, kind of just lied in limbo for a few years. There was no more physical media releases getting made of it. You couldn't watch it anywhere on streaming. And it was just a super messy situation. For some reason, they held on to the rights to the sequel 28 weeks later, but they let this lapse, which I think is a travesty that that was even allowed to happen in the first place, especially for a film that very much, in my opinion, transcends the genre. Most people have seen this movie, and as I was stating earlier, it was very impactful on the genre as well, and in the public zeitgeist, so there was no reason for any of that to happen. I think it's really pathetic on Disney's part to let that happen. Fortunately though, Andrew McDonald, a producer on the original film, was actually able to buy the rights back in 2024 and sold them off to Sony so that 28 years later could get made, which brings us back to present day, where we have Danny Boyle returning to the director's seat to even helm this upcoming sequel. And I have to say, thank God that they were able to wrap it up relatively quick and that it only lasted a couple years for that whole messy debacle to get solved and that the film didn't end up getting lost by any stretch of the word, because that is something that does worry me with this streaming age, is how easy it could be to lose films because everything is online now. One thing that I realized upon learning all of that though was that I assumed that the camera quality when I rented this film to watch it was bad because of the fact that it was put off and thrown to the wayside for so long. And then after looking into it and seeing what other people said online, I realized that no, it wasn't that at all. It was the fact that this was filmed on very cheap digital cameras, which Danny Boyle had reason for that. He wanted it to feel more realistic. Although I do find it kind of unfortunate that he did use such cheap cameras, because I do think that it makes some of the shots just look really fuzzy. And when I first initially started to rewatch it and I forgot that it looked like that, it did pull me out of the movie a little bit. But fortunately, this is a really, really good movie, and I would say less than 20 minutes into it, I was able to ignore that and like just sink right into the film. And that is genuinely the only nitpick that I have about this movie. Like I said, I'm just gonna get it right out of the way right now, because everything else in this film, I really think they did perfectly. The casting, all of that, it is so well done. Anyways, we're going to get into this movie a little bit. I'm going to talk spoilers, and it's an older movie. If you haven't seen it, go watch it. I highly recommend it. Go watch it. Now, in this video, I'm going to kind of jump around to like different scenes that I liked, and then like the characters. I'm not going to do a whole plot breakdown for this film. I'm going to continue to throw in some behind the scenes facts as I continue as well. But this isn't going to be like a whole breakdown of the whole story, so don't expect that from this video. Opening sequence of the film, when you have Cillian Murphy's character Jim waking up in the hospital, I think it's very excellently done when he's walking around the city streets of London. Immediately, there is so many instantly iconic shots shown throughout that. And another thing too that's a little side note that I want to mention is so frequently in horror films, they have no problem sexualizing girls and like having them go topless. And I gotta say, I appreciate a movie that has the balls to hang dong in said film. You don't see it that often, so I salute you for being able to do that. But back to talking about other stuff in this film. To backtrack a little bit on what I was just saying, all the shots that they did in the film were done practically as well. All of the iconic imagery that you see was shot early in the morning. They would close off some streets, and many times they only had minutes to do it as well before traffic would come back through. They would shoot these scenes very early, and they were able to get all these recognizable locations that are typically busy but have them look dead and desolate. I was even seeing in an interview that they were saying that though the streets look empty, if you look closely in some shots, you can still see people walking around the streets. I think they did a really good job capturing that, even with the time constraints that they did. That is stuff that I have never noticed before in the film. Any people walking around in the background, I haven't been looking for that either, and I really don't want to look for that because I don't want it to pull me out of the movie in any way personally when I rewatch it. Another iconic scene that you see as he's walking around the streets too, and this will be the last thing that I talk about, we're not going to spend the whole video just talking about this opening sequence, is the fact that as Jim's walking around, he goes by this overturned double-decker bus. And as I was reading the behind the scenes of that, I thought it was kind of funny. So they were able to do that entire shot within 20 minutes, overturn the bus, get the footage that they needed before cleaning everything up. They asked for permission to place the bus there, but they were denied that permission, and they decided to go against that anyways. And they went down there at 4 a.m. in the morning to get said shot, which I find to be total boss bitch behavior on Danny Boyle's part. As he's stumbling around the city streets, he ends up finding both Celine and Mark, and I'm only going to spend a short time talking about Mark, and I'm just going to get it out of the way now because he isn't in the film for long, but I do enjoy the impact that he ultimately ends up having on this movie. When Mark tells his story of how he discovered the virus and how it affected him, it very much tells you just how hopeless this new world is, and it's a very depressing sequence when he talks about how he literally was torn apart from his family in a crowd of people as he watched them and a whole bunch of strangers to get turned into these, for a lack of a better word, zombies. And it was just a very harrowing way that he told the story.
I looked down and I was standing on all these people like a carpet.
And then even leading up to his death when he ultimately gets infected, it's very much telling of how Celine has been shaped by this new world, for how quickly she's able to take him out before he even is able to turn, which leads to the line that she repeats over and over again: she would kill in a heartbeat. It's stories like that that I think are what hinge this film so well, that make it so relatable, is you see all of our characters throughout this film go through so much growth, and this is where I'm going to start jumping around a little bit more sporadically throughout the plot. You have Jim, who at the beginning of the movie doesn't understand what's going on, and eventually as he's in this world longer and sees how it works, he ends up developing more of a primal need to survive like everyone else has. Whereas Celine, who has that because she's been dealing with this already for 28 days, she is able to find some camaraderie and care for the group that she ends up falling with Jim and the other band of survivors, and that other band being both Frank and Hannah, who are the father-daughter duo in this film. And I very much think that their characters are the beacon of hope that keeps the group together in the beginning of the film, and are a lot of the reason why Celine is able to change her mindset. And their whole story between Frank and Hannah is very depressing as it continues on, when you ultimately have the tragic ending for the two of them. It even feels that much more depressing when everything comes to a head with the two of them, when you see how sweet their dynamic is throughout the film. Upon our two survivors, Jim and Celine, meeting the father and daughter, though, they are instilled with more hope that they didn't have previously. When Frank is able to convince them that they can go to this military compound and be saved, that there might even be a cure for this virus, and if not, at least they would be somewhere safe where they can be protected, which ultimately ends up leading to the section of the film that's kind of like a road trip movie, which where it reminds me the most of Zombieland, or where I guess Zombieland would remind me the most of this film, is the scene where they're at the grocery store, and in both films you can see they're trying to cling to some kind of normalcy in a world where they don't really have that anymore. And that is something that I always enjoy in a zombie movie. It makes it feel that much more grounded and that much more relatable to me that this is very real. You wouldn't 100% of the time always be in survival mode. in these movies, you would have moments where you would feel safe and put your guard down sometimes. At least that's what I think anyways. After this road trip though, and they end up making it to the military base, there's no one there. And through a horrific accident, Frank ends up getting infected, and it is the most depressing scene in this movie because right before that, him and Hannah are both fighting. And then shortly after that, he gets a blood drop from an infected dead body into his eye, and he realizes he's going to change. And he quickly apologizes to his daughter, tells her how much he cares about her, and then pushes her away from him because he knows that he's going to turn and change into one of those things. Before that, it was even that much more heartbreaking that he was the one that gave the group hope that the military compound would be a place to save all of them, when ultimately that's not what it was. It was completely empty, and he felt like he set them up for nothing and that there was no future for them whatsoever. Then we get to a more frustrating and even more heartbreaking moment of all this is the moment that he changes. All of a sudden, the military men are in the bushes and they shoot him down because they've been there the whole time, yet they never intervene to actually do anything or save him. And I very much think that's going to build into another theme that's in this film that I touched upon earlier of who are the real monsters in this world, and the whole how much can you trust your government. The moment that you see these military men, you know that you can't trust them, and as this whole climax goes on building into the end of the movie, you see that those feelings were very, very valid because fairly quickly after they're staying at the compound, it is revealed that the military men are going to keep both Hannah and Celine so that they can repopulate the Earth.
That's suspicious.
When no, they just want to get some bone because they've been stuck around a whole bunch of dudes for a while. Like, just say it, dude.
That's weird.
Obviously, Jim isn't okay with this, and he fights back, and they ultimately end up leaving him for dead, which leads us to the climax of this film, which is one of the most iconic scenes and one of the most iconic scores in any horror movie whatsoever. I fucking love In the House in a Heartbeat. I think many people can say that. Again, that is something that has transcended this movie. I remember even in middle school during a talent show, they would have the band kids go up on stage and play the piano for the entire school. This song got played at one talent show like 3 different times, and it perfectly makes sense because it is a really, really good song and it is so much fun. And I love the fact that this score from a horror movie was able to like slip into a school setting without like anybody raising an eyebrow just because it is that good. But it is this whole scene with the mix of the score, the editing, and the way it cuts from character to character that I would say very much encompasses how well this film is able to build tension. You have Jim sneaking into the house and doing away with different military men, releasing the infected to come after them. And then you have scenes like Hannah hanging off the backside of a mirror so that one of the infected doesn't see her while Celine is getting dragged down a hall by another military man. Like, this is all happening at the exact same time, and it's not messy. It's super well executed, and the entire time you're clenching your seat, waiting to see what's going to happen. It's just very nerve-wracking, and that's the best way to describe a lot of the tension in this film. Is it's very, very nerve-wracking. Before I discuss the ending of the movie, though, I wanted to talk about this behind-the-scenes fact. Originally, there were 3 different endings that were made for this movie. 2 of them were actually shot, and one of them was only storyboarded. The storyboarded idea was actually something along the lines of where Jim was going to decide to sacrifice himself and do a blood transfusion for Hannah's father, which would have brought him back to life. I personally find it to be a little sappy. I'm glad that never made it past the storyboarding phase. But then the other 2 endings are essentially the same with a minor difference to them. You have one ending where Jim gets shot and he ultimately dies, but then you have another ending as well where it shows that, but then it also shows the accident that ultimately led to him being in the hospital in the first place. But all these endings ended with Jim dying. Test screenings were done of this film and nobody liked it, and previously to that they ran out of money to film and make a better ending, but because test audiences didn't like the ending, the studio was willing to give them more money to shoot another ending which I find to be vastly superior to those ideas. I think this is such a downbeat movie with the times and like what was going on at the time. I don't think we needed that. It wouldn't be the escape that you'd want stepping into a movie theater, especially with the events that were going on with the news. You don't want something that downbeat. You want something more hopeful, which is ultimately what this ending ended up being. Just like in those endings, Jim does get shot, but Celine and Hannah are able to save him ultimately, and they end up finding refuge at this house in the countryside, and it shows them sewing all this fabric together to make this giant sign for this plane that's been going by that just says hello, which I find to be a really sweet ending. Instead of doing something like cheap, like saying help or something like that, it's hello. It's just very heartwarming to me, and it leaves things open. Even though it doesn't say the characters are safe by any means, it does feel very hopeful that there is a future ahead for all of them. And that is something that I very much enjoy about this ending that they ultimately decided to stick with. Upon release, this film ended up making over 84 million in the box office and ended up being one of the highest grossing horror films of that year, of a budget of only 8 million as well to make the movie, which might sound like a lot of money, but to make a movie like that, that's nothing. Obviously, with numbers like that though, and the return profit, they were going to make a sequel, which is going to lead us into the next review that I'm doing for 28 Weeks Later. I've already said it though. If you guys haven't seen this movie, you should go watch it. And today we're delving back into my coverage on the 28 Days Later franchise with 28 Weeks Later. Now, after the very inarguable success of 28 Days Later, it was very, very apparent that we were going to have a sequel, that it was guaranteed. And when this sequel did eventually come about, the biggest difference that ended up coming out of it was Danny Boyle didn't return to direct this film. So Juan Carlos Fresnadillo ended up taking over for this film, and little insert right here. I looked up how to pronounce that name. I still don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. So like, please bear with me if I'm mispronouncing and butchering his name. I very deeply apologize about that. I think Fresnadillo did a very good job taking over this film, but I do think there are aspects in this film where you can feel the absence of Danny Boyle in this film as well, and a lot of it has to come from the direction and the way the camera looks, and a lot of the editing used in this movie as well, which I will get into. The emotional weight in this movie as well don't seem to be as sharp, and the scale in this film is much bigger, taking place entirely in this London city essentially, but a lot of that trades any depth for our characters, and it doesn't feel anywhere near as intimate as the previous installment. By no means though is this a bad sequel by any stretch of the word. I wouldn't call it that at all. It is a good follow-up to a very good movie, but also in many aspects I feel like it plays it safe and doesn't try to take any risks. And I think that them waiting over 5 years to drop this film and not having Danny Boyle return into the director's seat and then hiring on a new staff of writers to write this film, I think it ends up making it feel not as special and good as the original installment. But before I get too ahead of myself, I should drop what the plot of this film is for you guys. Now, this film picks up 6 months after the original outbreak. The rage virus has supposedly run its course as seen at the end of the previous film, with infected, starving, and dying out, and the US Army steps in to help rebuild and repopulate parts of London. Refugees start coming back. Naturally, things don't stay safe for long when young siblings Tammy and Andy break protocol to find a photograph of their mother, and the result is a reintroduction of the rage virus into the safe zone. Right off the bat, the opening sequence in this film is one of the strongest scenes in this movie. I mean, it has the iconic song from the first film, In the House in a Heartbeat. So what more can I say there, really? You're shown a group of survivors who are holed up in a countryside cottage when the infected suddenly break in. It's a very fast and it's a very tense scene, and it leads to two characters, Dawn and Alice, who I'm going to talk about throughout this review, who are husband and wife, and she ends up getting cornered by a whole bunch of the infected. And Don ends up panicking, and his flight or fight kicks in, and he chooses flight, and he essentially abandons her and leaves her behind. I've seen in a lot of reviews too, where people talk about how he is a very clear villain in this story. I think this very much leans into the very nihilistic take, though, that this entire movie has. Don very much just has a human reaction to a situation where most people wouldn't even begin to know how to react in the first place. So, though I don't think it is the morally right thing to do for him to abandon his wife the way he did, I mean, obviously, but like, I can't really blame the guy either, because you can say not being in that situation, you wouldn't do that. But if you haven't been in that situation, do you really know that you're not going to end up doing something like that? Immediately after abandoning her, you see him sprinting away from the scene as a whole bunch of the infected are chasing after him. And this is a shot that I find to be very well done, and I feel like orchestrates some of the shaky camera work in this film that I think does work well. What doesn't work well in this opening sequence for me, though, and it's something that you see throughout this entire movie, is these jump cuts that they do constantly whenever you see people getting attacked by the zombies. It's very prevalent even in this opening sequence, as I said. When you see the infected break in, they end up biting one of the girls that's in the cottage. And it happens so quickly in the way the cuts are done that it feels very disorienting, but it's to a very detrimental effect, is what I would think of it. This was very peak edgy for edge's sake era filmmaking in the early 2000s. You see it in a lot of films. And in some movies, I think it works really well. What popularized it, I think, was like the Saw franchise, and I enjoy it in those movies. But more often than not, I am not a big fan of that type of filmmaking. Like I said, I find it more disorienting than anything else, and it kind of pulls me out of the story a little bit. And that's one of my biggest gripes I have with this film, because this wasn't really prevalent in the first installment, but it's very prevalent here. You even have this later scene where Andy is locked up in this room with all these other survivors. The infected end up breaking into the room and start ravenously going after this crowd of people. The scene is very tense on paper. In fact, I don't hate it, but the way that it's edited, it just feels very messy and sloppy to me. And this very much could be a nitpick that I have on my own for this movie. And it could also be because of the high esteem that I hold that first film to. But a lot of the stuff that's going on with the editing, the way the story is done throughout this whole movie, I very much find to be more of your run-of-the-mill zombie story. And like I said, I feel like it kind of misses the point of what the original film was. And that's something that you're going to hear me say a lot in this review, is I feel like there's a lot of stuff where this movie very much does a really good job, but as a sequel to 28 Days Later, I don't think it holds a candle to it. Which also leads into another thought I have about this movie. I think this one leans a lot more into horror action, whereas the first one I would say was just a direct horror film through and through. The emotional core of the movie, I feel like there's certain aspects where it shines through very well, but overall, I don't think that's what this movie is grounded on, is the emotional core of these characters, because you have characters like Mark in the previous film, who really is only in the movie for a small chunk, but I do feel like his small chunk of the film was very impactful, especially that monologue that he gives about what happened to his family when the outbreak initially broke out. I found to be very heartbreaking and made his character all the more memorable, and it was also that much more gut-wrenching when you see him die only a scene later. I thought that was done very well, but this film, the characters aren't that. They all feel very one note for the most part. There's only two standouts in this movie for me, and that is Andy and Tammy. They are the siblings in this movie, and I'm very much a sucker for sibling dynamics. I thought they did a really good job with those two, but everyone else felt gettable to me. In fact, I had to look up names for other characters to even remember who they were, like Don and Alice, who I mentioned a second ago, that open this film. They are the mother and father to them. And there's a lot of aspects to their characters that I enjoy. I even enjoy the subplot with those two. But I also feel like it could have been utilized and done better as well. The movie really does shine though is the larger scale of the city and seeing all these above shots of London, especially when you see the government take full control over the city once the virus again breaks out in this refugee camp. A lot of the shots they show of the above city are very beautifully shot, but also very horrifying at the same time. I think it is some of the best horror elements in this film is in those moments when you see the government decide to blow up the cities so that they can try to contain the infection. I think that's done very well. You have this shot where you see all the city streets just blowing to smithereens as you see the infected running, and then what survivors couldn't escape the city in time also getting caught up in the blaze. Then you have later in the movie where you see that the military floods the city with gas, which is very, very visually striking as well. It's also one of the more enjoyable sequences in the movie where you have our last group of survivors getting into a car, trying to avoid inhaling and getting caught in the gas, while one of the survivors ends up getting out and pushing the car, trying to help them escape. And he ends up sacrificing himself so they can get away. But it ends up turning into this group of characters trying to go down all these different city blocks, trying to avoid getting caught back up into the fumes. And again, is one of the more memorable sequences of the film for me. Another part of this film that kind of makes me raise a brow though is the way the infection is handled in this one versus the previous one. It feels a lot more theatrical to me and almost cartoony. I'm not the biggest fan of it and it pulled me out of it. It felt like it wasn't grounded as much realism. Just for example, when you jump to the outbreak of the infection at the refugee camp, you have Alice, who earlier in the film you assume that she died in that opening sequence after Dawn left her for dead. But Andy and Tammy end up finding her and she has been bitten, but she hasn't turned, so you have all these scientists looking at her, and it's a very interesting added layer to the story when they find out that she is infected with the virus, but she is not turning, that she is in fact just a carrier of said virus. I think it's very good world building, adding that little bit in there. But something that they talk about in that scene where they're talking about it, and this is something that I thought was well done before I get into my negative about the infected, is they talk about how she's a carrier, she's not showing any signs. Her saliva and her blood are just as dangerous to come in contact with as they would be with a normal infected person as well. To backtrack to what I was saying, you end up having Dawn, who discovers that she's alive, and he ends up breaking security protocol and going to see her. And when he goes and sees her, they have this little bit of a reunion, and it seems like she forgives him, and he goes in and kisses her, and they literally swap spit, which obviously leads to him getting infected with the virus. He doesn't have a natural immunity to it like she does. When you're seeing him changing, it's very horrifying, and I like the build-up for that. I think it's very well done, especially as you see Alice thrashing about in this hospital bed, tied down, unable to escape. But that's when it veers off course for me, is after he turns, and where I get frustrated with infected Dawn for the rest of the movie a little bit. This leads to him running around and bashing people's heads in constantly, and it also leads to him gouging their eyes out. It feels very cartoonishly brutal to me in many moments, and I'm not the biggest fan of it. And again, I keep saying it, I think the first one was so grounded in realism with the way they handled the infected people in it, where this one doesn't feel like that to me. The film also ends up ending on a pretty big cliffhanger. The ending of this movie isn't bad, but it is frustrating in retrospect when you've read news about the upcoming sequels for this film. But at the end of the film, you have Andy and Tammy, who are being protected by one of the scientists and a military man, because they both know that these kids could hold the answer to a cure for the virus because their mom was immune. They might have the same immunity. It's discovered towards the end of the movie that Andy, in fact, does. He ends up getting bit by his father, and when Tammy goes and saves him, he does not turn, but he gets the pigmentation to one of his eyes, just like his mother did, of someone that is infected, but he himself doesn't start to act like an infected person. And it ends with the two of them getting into this helicopter, Tammy lying about him being bitten. Jump cuts to a little bit later, and you see that the helicopter's crashed. You don't see Andy or Tammy, and then it shows Paris being overrun by zombies immediately after, and then the film cuts to black. It's not a bad ending by any means, but a lot of the press articles I have been reading about the upcoming sequels have been discussing how they're essentially going to sidestep this movie, that it's still going to exist in universe. I think it was very confusing what I was reading. It was very back and forth. If someone understands the situation a little bit better, then by all means put it in the comments down below. But I find it kind of frustrating that we are ditching those characters, because this movie isn't a bad movie by any means. I know I've been kind of harsh on it, but like I said, I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that the movie that it's following up to, I think, is next to perfect. And this one is, again, your very typical zombie story. And I, too, want to see a happy ending for these two sibling characters. Like I said, I'm a total sucker for seeing a cute sibling dynamic in a movie. And I am not the biggest fan of this very nihilistic ending that we end up getting, because this entire movie is kind of a downer through and through. You don't see really anything good or happy happen to these characters. Even these two kids, you just want them to catch a break constantly. When you see them pulling up in a train, see their parents who they haven't seen for God knows how long since this infection broke out. You have them getting to their dad and then finding out that their mom's dead, and then finding out that their dad lied about what happened to their mom at the beginning of the movie, only for their dad to die and then their mom to die, and they are left alone with only each other. They only have each other. Like, it's very, very heartbreaking stuff, and I would love to see a happy ending for them. Getting a happy ending for them, I feel like, would be way more in touch with what the original movie was. That is very much something I heavily praised in that first film, was the happy ending that they did end up using in it. They had ideas for multiple other more downbeat endings, but they eventually ended up going with something more hopeful, which I thought was very good for that film, especially for the times that it came out, and I very much appreciated that take. I wish this movie would have followed up with that, because this movie, it continues with themes of government overpower and of what human reactions would be in such a high-stress situation, but there's no hope behind it. You don't have characters like Hannah and Frank giving you hope. You don't have characters that end up flipping a leaf like Celine and realizing that not everything has to be all bad. It's not like that at all. It's a very hopeless film, and that's something that I just kind of find to be disappointing about this installment in the franchise. Is I don't think that they should have went so heavily into that. And part of the reason I want them to come back so bad in this franchise as well is Imogen, who played Tammy, she expressed interest back in 2020 that she would come back and play her character again. If she's down for it, then, like, why not sign her up, man? Like, have her come back. That would be great. And I think so many people would be down with that. Because by all means, this isn't a bad movie. It doesn't need to be forgotten. They don't need to equal treatment it or even sidestep it as like a side movie or whatever. Like, it would be really cool if we had both Tammy and Andy running around in a future installment, because really they are our only survivors in this film anyways. So it shouldn't be that hard to, like, just write them in somewhere and bring them back organically. But to sidestep the review aspects of this video, and if you've seen my other videos, you guys know that I just can't help myself but to talk about some viral marketing campaigns. 28 days before the release of this film in the UK, they flashed this huge biohazard sign against the white cliffs of Dover. And below the biohazard sign that they decided to flash up there, it said "Contaminated, keep out." I think that's a really fun addition, especially with the 28 days before its release. Like I keep telling you guys in all these videos, I am a sucker for a good viral marketing campaign. But ultimately, this film didn't end up being as much of a financial success as that first movie. That first movie very much caught lightning in a bottle. But what it did end up making in the box office was nothing to be scoffed at either. It ended up rounding up over 65 million, which ended up meaning that another sequel would be inevitable. Said sequel would remain in production hell for like well over a decade, seeing as we're just barely getting the third installment here in a couple weeks. But trust me, I will get way more into that when I inevitably end up reviewing 28 years later. To wrap up this video and give my overall thoughts, like I said, this isn't a bad movie. It's a decent follow-up. In fact, if you're a fan of the first film, go and watch this one. This sequel is very inoffensive. If I sounded negative towards it throughout this video, it's because I hold that first one in such high regard. I also don't think it's a bad movie by any stretch of the word at all, and I wouldn't try to convince you guys otherwise either. You guys should let me know what you thought of 28 Weeks Later, and if you think that I'm being too harsh on it, leave a comment down below and tell me your opinions. Or if you feel the same way that I did, like, I'd love to hear that down below too. Sorry if I was like a little too harsh on this movie as well, like I keep saying, but I want to keep things real on this channel and what my opinions are. I'm not going to try to front you guys if I like something or dislike something here. Like, I want to give my very honest take, whether it be popular or unpopular. Like, I don't care. I want to be as legit as I can about things. It goes without saying as well, though, that I won't be releasing any more videos in this series until I eventually go see 28 Years Later in theaters, so stay tuned for that. And if you want to see that eventual video, subscribe to this channel. I would love to have you guys. And if you have any other recommendations for any other franchises that you want me to cover, leave that in the comments right down below. I would love to hear them. And if you just have any solo movie reviews that you want me to do or cover, I'm all ears for that. I say it in every video at this point. I cover everything and anything horror on this channel. But anyways, this has been Justice, and I really hope to see you guys on the next one. Take care.